Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So shout out and thanks to James. So I feel really honoured to work with the crew above that you saw on the previous screen, as well as with our wider Centre of Research Excellence, Indigenous Health and Alcohol team. And today, when I was thinking about it last night, I want to give you the ultimate tour through our Grog app and a bit about how we developed it. So I think I need to get a push on. So I'm going to kind of show you where does the story start, some particular challenges that we had to take into account when you're asking about drinking. And then I'll take you through what the app looks like, some key screens, what difference can it make? So how could we show that it could be accurate and acceptable? And where to from here, because this is really just the first part of the story. So when you tell any story about the Grog app, and if you were to Google it, you often come up with a picture of Scott, Associate Professor Scott Wilson, who is from the Aboriginal Drug and Alcohol Council of South Australia. You see Scott, and you also see Professor Kate Conograve, who's at Sydney Uni and RPA, and Kate is the CIA on the Grog app. So Scott and I co-conceived the idea for the Grog app, and it was actually back in 2012. NIDAC stands for the National Indigenous Drug and Alcohol Conference. They have it every 2 years. And back in Fremantle in 2012, Scott and I were in like the last resolutions closing session. And he said, you know, we've heard and seen so many presentations on great work here, largely from many frontline workers, which is excellent. But he was remarking that as a CEO of a health service, a community controlled one, that the need that he sees on the ground in terms of alcohol, as well as other drug issues, doesn't match the funding that gets allocated. And he's very aware, being a CEO, that it's very much state and national surveys that help the government work out how to allocate funding. So he was like, what is it with the prevalence rates of alcohol and other drug use that we're seeing, because we're not seeing enough money go to the right spots. So we went to Kate, and who had worked previously on audit for her PhD, and she's a very experienced addiction medicine specialist, and we pulled together a whole team of people to see whether they could help us design this new tool, because we felt like if we had a better tool, then we could eventually give that back to communities and health services. They could be measuring their own data to monitor how they're going with drinking, and using that to feed back to state, territory or federal governments. 2015, we were lucky enough to be awarded a project grant, and that actually recently just finished this year, because we ended up extending it through COVID, etc. So stepping back in terms of some other reasons to do the research, I'm not sure how many alcohol or other drug researchers we have here with us today, but worldwide, alcohol is the biggest cause of years lost to illness or death for young adults. And that's particularly relevant for priority populations such as Indigenous peoples, and certainly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, because the median age is so much younger in those populations, such as what we have here in Australia. But so whilst it affects a lot of younger people in the world, it can be really hard for anyone, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, Chinese, whatever, to describe how much they're drinking for a range of reasons. Yet research from one of our CIs, Tanya Secrecies, has shown that drinking surveys of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are actually underestimated by up to 700% in women and 200% in men. And that kind of goes back to Scott's question of, I'm not seeing the money that we need on the ground. And that's likely because, as Tanya's saying, that the surveys are just so out. So, Scott is a visionary and a big picture guy. He always wanted to add in, other drugs as well. But then we pulled in really eminent kind of alcohol sociologists and epidemiologists like Professor Robin Room and Professor Tanya from Curtin. And they really advised that we needed to do that later. It was simply going to be too hard to design a grog and drug app all at the one time. So why don't we just focus on alcohol, given what we saw before in terms of the burden of disease study and the impact that alcohol has globally. So today I'm going to show you the Grog app. It measures drinking only. We ask about consumption, and we do that by using a visual operationalized version of audit C's. So audit the 3 questions on consumption of the full audit screening test. We also ask about dependence. So using the ICD criteria that we've operationalized, so that's just 3 criteria. We ask about harms to self and others, and this really draws on Robin and Tanya's work that they've done on a WHO harms to others study. We ask about treatment access, and then everyone gets tailored feedback or a brief intervention based on their responses. And that was really important for us. When we put in the application to NHMRC, we actually didn't say that we were going to do tailored feedback. And as soon as we started talking to community and to health services around the country, of course, it was kind of like a bit embarrassing that we'd forgotten it. Very lucky to get the funding, but it was a no-brainer if you're going to be asking information from people so that we could develop the app. It's very important to give practical, immediate kind of reciprocity in that research arrangement. So we wanted to straight away give them, this is how much you said that you drink, and these are some suggestions or to consider. And the tailored feedback, or brief intervention as it's called in my world, is one that Kate had developed or adapted for an urban Aboriginal population based on a WHO alcohol brief intervention. The app is designed to be flexible. So in addition to those questions, you can also add in custom questions. So if I wanted to add in questions about environmental health, so perhaps how many people living in your house, or maybe about diet, what sort of food or sugary drinks that you're eating, etc., you can also add in those questions to ask alongside the validated items. So when we started thinking about how are we going to develop the app, of course, we had to sort of review some of the challenges. So what were the things that we're up against in terms of difficulties about asking about drinking? So before we actually wrote the grant, we actually wrote this commentary paper that kind of just reviews, obviously it's talking about alcohol and other drug use, but we wanted to think about what were the things that are so tricky in our CI's perspective when you're coming up against asking about drinking, not just in a tablet environment or a paper and pen, but even just for clinicians as well. So certainly when you're looking at national surveys, one of the issues by far was about sampling approaches. So the national surveys survey very few Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In fact, the latest National Drug Strategy Household Survey only asks Aboriginal people from NT as well. So it's not, it doesn't have Aboriginal people in it participating from around the country. People are also asked, they're able to participate if they have a fixed address. So you're not seeing people who are living rough or homeless, or maybe in temporary accommodation, in hospital, in prison, etc. And as I mentioned, very few small numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I guess where we could come in and see about how we could address some of these challenges was in regards to survey administration. So the survey only been asked in English, or what if the person wasn't very comfortable with reading and literacy levels, as well as cultural barriers. So how are you asking the question in a way that the person is able to understand from their own cultural worldview? And confidentiality is a big one. So I think in any population, asking about drinking is sensitive, and arguably when you're asking in a priority population, it's even more sensitive given past government policies and histories of children being taken away, etc. There's a very great fear when I've asked paper and pen interviews, say at a drug treatment service in Sydney, you really need to allay people's fears around what the data is going to be used for. And there were many, many challenges in terms of the survey items themselves, and I'm going to take you through some of that now. So what I mean by that is the existing tools that are there to ask people about how much they drink. We had lots of kind of worries about how that might translate to making it feel comfortable and a not judgmental experience for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to answer. So the first challenge is, how much is a drink anyway? So certainly in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, our Aboriginal CIs and AIs would say, you know, people drink from a range of containers, yet the national surveys ask about very specific containers like a shot, a 30 ml shot of spirits, or a wine glass. And even the wine glass is very much smaller than what you would get in a typical kind of pub or in a restaurant. And this is a situation that Kate had. They had a client come into a service that Kate works at, and I'll just call him John for the purpose of this story. She had much more junior clinicians kind of saying, you know, John, how much do you drink? And he would say, I just have 2 drinks of wine. They'd go, okay, well, there's no need for me to talk to you anymore because that's pretty much within the limits. But John keeps coming back in and he keeps coming back in, and they sort of start to worry about maybe it's something to do with alcohol. So they get Kate to see him. And it turns out, of course, Kate, being a very experienced kind of clinician, says, John, what do you drink out of? And this is what he's drinking out of. So every day he's siphoning white wine or whatever wine he has into this big sports bottle, which is obviously way, way more than the other clinicians had envisaged. And I guess the big lesson from this from us is that people drink from a range of containers, and they're not always going to look like the containers that that are asked about in the national surveys, because they don't ask about non-standard containers in which people might siphon into. Obviously, they ask about the cask wine. So it's really important to be allowing people to make it as easy as possible for them to say how much they drink using containers that they actually drink from. So some other challenges in terms of the survey items. Many people in Australia, and not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, I certainly know lots of my friends, they simply don't know what a standard drink is. Yet all surveys ask respondents to quantify how much they drink according to standard drinks, and they also might perhaps include the alcohol.gov.au standard drinks chart, but you're asked to kind of do that conversion yourself and write 1.5 or 3 or 5 or whatever is the case. So I guess that's the beauty of having an app interface and a tablet, is that we focus on getting people to feel comfortable to tell the story. And then in the back end, the app is computed to calculate the standard drinks for us. So we actually never need to ask those kind of scary-ish kind of maths and number questions. Sharing can also be very common in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's drinking, from what we've seen and what our Aboriginal colleagues tell us. So yet the surveys only ask people to talk about themselves. So it takes a very individualistic approach. So we had to somehow factor that into the app. The other thing is, national surveys tend to ask you about what you did in the last 12 months, yet I find, I mean, I've worked a lot and lived in remote NT. I'm from Darwin originally. I find certainly in a remote or even in Darwin context, it can be tricky when you're doing surveys to get people to understand the last 12-month kind of time frame, let alone it's been tricky for me to explain that to someone in Sydney. So we really needed to think about what kind of anchor or reference point could we use so that people understand the time frame, because if they don't understand the time frame, and then they also don't understand the question, then the data is pretty useless to us. We had a forum at the start of the app where we brought Aboriginal health professionals, some of the CIs, and Aboriginal researchers into the room. And I remember saying to them, what about this concept of usual drinking? And I remember a very, very experienced AOD clinician from Queensland said, there is just no usual drinking. Drinking is just so episodic in our peoples. And I was a bit cheeky and I kind of tried a synonym and I said, what about typical drinking? And he's like, no, I kind of got bounced. So again, all of the surveys will ask, how much do you usually drink? 1 to 2 standard drinks, 3 to 4, etc. Or how often do you usually drink? So these are all kind of challenges that we had to kind of face when we were thinking about how on earth were we going to come up with questions that were going to suit a cultural context, but also be accurate. From an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective, there can also be a lot of shame around drinking from past and actual experiences of racism and government policies that I've already mentioned. So this was a really big one. How could you design an app that could help people not feel judged and help people just tell their story without fear that that someone might take their kid away, or that they might be seen as, in brackets, a alcoholic or something like that. So certainly trying to create the most comfortable kind of environment for people to share and tell their story was paramount. And this leads into this next bullet point, because a lot of people said that they simply have a lot of worries about what the survey information will be used for. And this is where, you know, we've done a lot of work where to not collect personal identifying information, not collect any names. And we're constantly kind of talking to the app developers about that as well, because there's the function in the app where you can come in, you can stop the app, and then someone can come back and find themselves. And whenever we're now redeveloping the app at the moment, which I'll tell you about at the end, and whenever we're doing it, I'm always in there with Monica and James and the other project team, kind of saying, we can't collect any personal identifying information like date of birth, say, mother's maiden names, all of that kind of stuff, because we need to allay people's worries about the confidentiality of the data. So with all of that, we ended up designing this app, and I'm going to take you through it now. So the way we did it was kind of, I guess, your standard validation study. We did a whole lot of consultation and research. I mentioned the big forum that we had, where we had Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal experts come in and advise us. We had a process, but in that we also reviewed the other surveys. So we reviewed the Finnish method, we reviewed national surveys, what Audit does, what City does, what SDS does, all of these, some validated tools, some national surveys or WHO led surveys, to see how everyone else does it. We also looked at some community-based surveys, so some done by an amazing psychiatrist who works a lot in the Cape and the top of the Kimberley, Ernest Hunter. We looked at Alan Clough's studies, just to see, how do people ask about drinking? What's the best of what we can draw in here? We developed that survey, and then we went to the developers to help us kind of make it into action. This middle bar here is the validation study where we tested it, and I'll kind of take you through some of those findings. And then after that, this is where James came on board, helped us do that analysis, and then we refined it based on what the community leaders and respondents told us and what the RAs told us. And then 2019, we tested it in 2 more communities. And this time we're testing it as a practical survey tool, so where we actually recruited a prevalence study. And I'll tell you just a little bit of that story as well, if there's time. So the process to develop the app, we actually ended up, it was fascinating, I think. So we actually ended up writing a paper about how we developed it. And I thought it was kind of important to kind of show you these underpinning principles first, before I kind of take you through a spin through the app. So the app needed to suit First Nations Australians just for an ethics reason. It was 16 years and above. If we went lower than that, we'd need to get parental consent, and that would raise a lot of other issues in terms of how comfortable the younger people would feel to complete it. But importantly, it needed to be comfortable for people that simply don't have much comfort with technology. And I certainly met some younger people like that, as well as, you know, middle-aged right through to older people in the prevalence study. It needed to suit a range of contexts. So people who lead a more traditional lifestyle, where they're still practicing culture regularly, etc., living in isolated areas, right through to urban, people that speak Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander language, and people that don't, people that have had access to schooling, people that haven't, etc. As I mentioned before, it needs to be a very comfortable place that doesn't judge people. We're just asking them to tell us their drinking story, and in the back end, the app does all those sorts of calculations. It needs to work offline. So certainly sometimes when I'm in urban settings, it can, the internet can kind of go in and out, but certainly when we're remote, that's a really, really big issue. So the app is designed you need the internet obviously to get the app onto the device, but once it's on the device, it'll run offline, which was really, really important for us. Community leaders advised us in the forum that ultimately, not in the validation stage, but ultimately later on when the app was validated, that they wanted to be able to also get a de-identified summary of the completed surveys and even a report. And I guess this was talking to the fact that a lot of Aboriginal health services or community controls, they often might not have the research capacity there. So someone with skills like what James has to kind of punch the numbers and work out what are the median standard drinks, how many people are dependent, all of those sorts of figures. So the app can actually create a simple report based on the surveys that are being completed as well. And lastly, we didn't want to go out on a limb and just design something just for the sake of it and something all just new. It still needed to be comparable so that we could compare what we were seeing on the app with the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, or with audit scores, or with existing kind of literature out there in terms of national surveys or international surveys, as well as screening tools. So which was a balancing act. So some items were kind of new and some items were existing, such as Audit C. So let's have a spin. I'm going to move this Zoom bar down so I can see. So this is one of the first screens in the app once you get into the alcohol section. So a few things to tell you about on this screen. The app has 4 voices, so male and female. Talia, who is our research assistant, got all of these screen grabs for me. So she had obviously selected that she was a woman. Therefore, she'll see pictures of women throughout the app, and having that gendered pictures that goes through was a really big thing that came out of the forum so that people can feel comfortable. The app also can speak to you in Pitjantjatjara as well, which is an Aboriginal language spoken in the sort of bit of Australia between Queensland and SA and the NT. And we chose Pitjantjatjara because it's a language that is very much commonly spoken. Babies still will speak Pit in certain communities in Australia, and it's also taught in a university in South Australia. So we knew that it would be, there would certainly be the linguistic expertise to help us do the translation and back translation, which we did according to WHO kind of practices when we were ready to kind of record the app. The other red circle you can see here, I mentioned about timeframes. So how we got around getting people to understand the last 12 months is that there are 4 timeframes that will dynamically change. So Talia obviously got this screen grab around the NRL AFL Grand Finals. So maybe she did it around September. And so it's asking her, have you had any grog at all in the last 12 months since AFL NRL Football Grand Final last year? So if I was to do it in April, it would say since last Easter, or do it in December, it would say sort of since Christmas, New Year. So it dynamically alters according to when you're completing the app. And if communities want to add in their own things, so if I'm in Darwin, it would say since Darwin Cup Day. If it was July or whenever Cup Day is, then you can add in local kind of reference points as well. But for some people, when they're answering this question, if I was to say no, some people identify a drinker in this particular population as someone who really has problems with drinking. So someone who you see who's always drunk or intoxicated or having injuries related to drinking. So it was really important if someone selects no for us to kind of ask this check. And this is exactly the sort of check that Kate and other clinicians that we work with would ask as well. So can I check? Even at special events like weddings, funerals, sporting carnivals, have you had any grog at all? And we did have some people that would say yes here. So the check acts as a safety net to kind of collect people and put them down the current drinker path. If you click no, then you go to other questions around motivations for why you didn't drink, reasons for why you didn't drink, and then you would still go into harms and treatment access, but obviously you get a much shorter survey. So the app draws on a combination of timeline followback, so the work of Sibel and Sibel, as well as the finish method. We really want to, which is the last 4 occasions, we really want people to have their memory jogged in terms of where they were and what they were doing, who they were with, as opposed to standard surveys that would just start with, do you usually drink, how often, and how much do you usually drink? We kind of want that soft landing, so to speak. I call it a soft landing so that the survey isn't as full on, because we are asking about a really sensitive topic. But also we want to jog people's memories. So where were you drinking? They can select a number of these, and there are more options over the page as well. How many people were you drinking with? So this is an animation. It goes to 10 plus. I can pull the slider across and it'll bring more women into the drinking circle. The pictures of the women and the men have deliberately kind of been designed. I actually got permission from my various Aboriginal friends and said, can I use your picture and give it to our artist? We wanted, because it needed to suit a range of contexts. So you don't just want pictures of, say, the older lady sitting in the camp chair, who to me looks like, you know, she could be from around Alice or around Darwin. You needed a range of looks and feel of people, because there's, you know, a great diversity out there. So this is what we call the main grog shop, if you like. So what types of grog were you drinking that day? Other, across the end, we were advised to put things like methylated spirits in other. We're also advised to put cocktails into other, because that's not very common either, and things like mouthwash, etc. But these are the common ones. So beer, wine, port, sherry, spirits, and cider. And you can click on any of them. So as I mentioned, we also enable people to describe their drinking using non-standard containers as well. So in this case, Talia is saying that she had white wine, and we're selecting a water bottle of some sort. So here you can see Talia's brought the water bottle nearly up to the top. So again, the app is able to do all of the calculations in the back end. The individual never needs to say how many standard drinks they had. Sometimes this came up with spirits. If you were to say to fill up the bottle with Jim Beam or something, we had some people, when I was helping out during data collection, where they would pour it right to the top, but it actually wasn't right to the top. They had Coke or lemonade or something in there as well. So we added this fizzy drink or juice as well. So you can actually show how much was the alcohol and how much was the fizzy drink. And then Talia obviously changed container here to a sports bottle, but you can pull it across to show how many of those you did have. As I mentioned, some people share, and some people also find it easier to describe what the whole group drinks, as in they'll remember it that way more accurately, as opposed to just how much I drank as an individual. So if I go back here, this is clearly more than 7 standard drinks, because if you've got like 6 sports bottles of white wine. If the product that you've entered here is more than 7 standard drinks, then you will get this screen. Just want to check, is that what you had or what the whole group had? And Talia's going to say the group. And then it'll show you an equal share based on how many people you had in your drinking circle. So it's going to assume that everyone was fair. And then you can move it up or down. So in this case, Talia was a little bit greedy. Talia had more than her other drinking partners, but you could move it right back to say you only had half a bottle or a third of a bottle of wine. And that's taking into account the fact that a lot of people feel more comfortable to recount what they drank according to what the whole group drank. Likewise, what we've found is that surveys don't ask about periods of not drinking, and certainly in episodic, in communities with episodic drinking patterns, that's quite often the case. So we ask, you know, have you had a time when you've had no grog at all? And how long was that time? So obviously we're interested in the last 12 months. So it goes up to 11 months and 3 weeks, and you can show that. And interestingly, analysis led by one of our med students, or now doctor, and RA Catherine Zeng, have shown that in women, this dry patch can be a median of 90 days, and in men, it can be 60 days. Oh, sorry, 30 days. So it's kind of a median of 60 between the men and women. So we're talking about really long dry patches in the year in some communities. We ask about dependence as well. So this is one of those. You'll see here that particularly our Aboriginal AIs, Jimmy Perry, who works with Scott, he really wanted to kind of make it a bit more colloquial, and they felt like, just asking once in a blue moon. So we still have what the other surveys have down the bottom, so hardly ever or less than once a month. But just as the main response up the top, he felt like everything else was kind of plain English enough, but this one was just a bit too wordy. And we felt like if people weren't that comfortable with literacy, we might lose them, and they might not understand what that means. As I mentioned, each person then receives tailored feedback based on their survey responses. And this is that WHO adapted brief intervention that Kate and Brad Freeburn from Amos Redfern and a whole lot of other people had developed. And we tested back in 2010, 2011, and wrote it up in 2012. So we took that paper-based resource that they had designed for clinicians to use, and it's actually a resource that I see drugs and pregnancy nurses and other clinicians using with any client at RPA. And we have turned it into an app format where those voices, the male, female, English and PIT, will speak to you. So they'll tell you, this isn't the first screen. The first screen is the one that says about how much they say they drink. So the median standard drinks, and then it places them in the risk triangle, which is what the WHO tool does. And then it gives them some various amounts of advice. So this is some tips if they want to cut down on grog, but it also gives tips on harms from drinking. And a newer version that we're designing at the moment is going to talk to you about harms in terms of how it might damage connection to country or connection to family or spirit. So we're bringing in the principles from the social and emotional well-being model to try and get people to reflect on their drinking as well. So that's a super quick tour around the app, but what difference can it make? So what James and I were working on with the CIs when we finished that validation study data collection is, it was really, can a visual finish method, so the finish method asks about the last 4 occasions of drinking in the last 12 months. And Alanko, who designed this method, he said, or he and team felt like this was a good method, particularly when you have a lot of episodic drinkers. Can it accurately estimate drinking patterns when delivered on our iPad app? And we're comparing it against a clinical interview done by an Aboriginal health professional. That was really important to us because we really wanted to have an equitable approach. We needed to compare the app with what would be commonly available across the country in your primary healthcare settings, so your GP clinic or your Aboriginal medical service, etc. And instead of comparing it against a psychologist, because not all services have that, not all services have a Kate, like an addiction doctor either, not all services have a GP either. So we felt like an Aboriginal health worker and not an Aboriginal drug and alcohol worker deliberately, because not all services would have one, but most services would have an Aboriginal health worker, all services. So that's why we compared our app with a clinical interview conducted by that health professional. So we asked 200 people, and we did it in a primary healthcare service in urban Queensland, as well as in remote and regional SA, and that was in a drug and alcohol service in SA, as well as in a primary healthcare service. We had to go to the drug and alcohol service in SA because, as you can see here from recruitment, we also needed to recruit people who were dependent or likely dependent. And when we were data collecting, we couldn't find anyone like that at the primary healthcare service itself. As you can understand, because we are testing it, we needed to test it with non-drinkers as well, right through to people, we call them social drinkers, but basically they're people drinking within the recommended Australian guidelines. And this is the old guidelines because we data collected in 2016. And also the people who were hooked, that's what we call it, hooked on grog, kind of like a fishing hook. So everyone did the iPad and then attended that clinical interview that I spoke to you about, and the order was randomized. So some people did clinical interview first and then the app. And then so we could do retest reliability. The participants then took the app again. So there were 3 contact points that they would have with our RAs on the ground in Queensland and in regional and remote SA. But we were comparing 2 really different techniques. For the app, we were comparing the last 4 occasions, so frequency as well as how much. So when they drank in the last 4 occasions in the last 12 months, as well as how much. And from the clinical interview perspective, we were doing it how a clinician would normally do it. So they ask a 2-week diary. If they didn't have anything to drink in that 2-week diary, we go out to a month. And that's the classic kind of timeline follow back, Sibel and Sibel. So James had to do some very fancy footwork in terms of matching the reference points for each tool. So what we found here, and this is from our validation paper, just shout out if you want a copy of it, is that when we matched the time periods here, as you can see, the non-grade area, the app was very similar to the interview with classifying risky drinking. In fact, it classified a few more people at short-term risk, particularly interested in short-term risk because that's what we would see amongst population of people who where episodic drinking is very common. So the app and the interview were very similar. And if you look at a different kind of analysis here, you can see that, you know, you've got 18 median standard drinks per day versus 16, yet when you're looking at per day, it's very few, but again, very similar between app and interview. So they agreed, you know, more than 3/4 of the time. So we also found that when we would measure consumption on the app, so the finished method, last 4 occasions, it correlated really well. In fact, it correlated better with the responses on the app, as you can see here, than it did with the interviews. And I think partly this could be because you've got a standardized way that those dependence items are being asked each time, as opposed to clinicians asking it slightly differently each time. And the retest reliability was great. So I'm going to zip through some of this because I can see that I'm running late. I told you I like talking about this story. I'm sorry. So feedback, 6 people found it hard to use. Interestingly, they were mostly in Queensland, which was the urban site. The SA remote site, we had older, white-haired, you know, nanas and poppers kind of saying, oh, it's just great to hear a survey written in, you know, listening to a survey in my language. They didn't seem to have a lot of trouble, but in the Queensland site, the older people had more trouble. But a major issue was that last 4 occasions. So if you can imagine it, it says, when did you drink? Most recent time. When was the time before that? Time before that? Time before that. It felt like Groundhog Day, and it felt like people like they were doing the wrong thing. They couldn't get out of Groundhog Day. So that was a really big thing we needed to address. But some great spontaneous feedback, people saying, I didn't realize I was drinking that much once they get to that risk triangle at the end. And more than half of the respondents commented to their local RA that the app made them think about their drinking or the drinking of someone that they loved, which was really great because most clinicians will tell you that it's really hard to have a conversation with people about drinking because it is just so sensitive. I'm going to zip through only because of time, but the next bit I want to show you is how do we address that Groundhog Day? So how can we reduce the number of occasions that we're asking about, because people felt like they were going in this feedback loop and it was just asking again, 4 times over. So this is, I promise, not as scary as it looks, but basically what it's trying to do, we're just trying to establish on the left-hand side here, how many times would we need to ask in detail about people's quantity? So we ask 4 times about quantity, and we ask about 4 times about frequency or when they drank. That's what the app currently did at the validation phase. And there's 100%, it was going great. But we actually worked out that we could ask about the frequency when people drank, about the last 4 dates when you drank in the last 12 months. And we could ask in detail just about 2 times, the two of the most recent occasions, and we'd still have 99.7% accuracy compared with asking about what we were asking before in terms of the 4 times. So as you can see here, if you go down to just asking in detail about one occasion and the frequency of when they drank 4 times, you still get 96%. But we felt like that was too big a leap for us because we knew that in our population, it's quite known that people can be very episodic drinkers. So we felt like we were hinging too much on a bet if we were just to ask about in detail about one drinking occasion and we'd go down to 96.6. We wanted to keep with the ask in detail about the last 2, but the frequency of the last 4. So I hope that's not confusing. So that's where we stuck. So what did we land with? We knew that drinking occasions did not vary greatly within person. So fewer occasions could accurately summarize most people's drinking at that 99.7% variance that I showed you. So if you remember at the start of the talk, I showed you the commentary that we wrote, and I said that there were challenges. So the bottom 2, we kind of were able to address in part. I say in part because recruitment kind of comes into survey administration as well, but certainly with survey content, people were really happy, and the science kind of showed that we were able to ask it. It was accurate compared with what a clinical interview would said, in some cases more accurate when we're looking at some of the consumption and dependence. But there was this big question around sampling, big question around surveys only sampling fixed addresses, etc. So I don't have time to go into this, but I just wanted to show you the paper. But I love data collection. It's one of my favorite parts of the study. I think it reminds me of when I used to do health promotion and other stuff on the ground in remote communities, but it certainly takes a whole village to do it. And the expertise of our local RAs, Aboriginal RAs who helped us. And this is Talia here and Tegan. Tegan's a PhD student with the CRE and Talia's admin and RA. So what we did to test whether it could be a practical survey tool is that we surveyed participants, urban, remote. 730 people started the app, 706 completed it without any issues. In the urban site, where we wanted, obviously trying to recruit a representative community sample, it was equivalent to more than 1/3 of the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. So as you can imagine, the alcohol epidemiologists on our team were like, whoa, that's amazing, amazing lot of data. And I'm kind of just going to flash this up here because I don't have time to go into it. But really, what we did is that we used a quota-based kind of convenient sample that's stratified for age and sex. And we found that the sample, that 37 or more than 1/3 of Aboriginal peoples that we recruited in the urban site was actually very similar to the 2019 census. So the census of population and housing in terms of age, sex, median income earned, educational attainment. And interestingly enough, we didn't stratify to this, but it also matched the local urban site census data in terms of Aboriginal language spoken at home. So that was interesting as well. So have a look out for it if you're interested in on the ground stuff. It was an approach where we decided that we didn't just want people to come to us. So we didn't just do health service recruitment or other sort of employment service recruitment. We spent most of the time going to people. So at NAIDOC events, local festivals, shopping centres, etc. Because I think for me, I've done a lot of data collection and you just want to make it really easy for people. So we kind of went where people were, if they were already doing their shopping, etc. This study yielded a whole series of papers. So this is Catherine's paper that James and I supervised her for her MD project. And so this is the first most detailed study of patterns of drinking. So in a representative sample using the approach that I've just very quickly told you about, but using the Grog app to collect it on. So here, for the first time, you're finding out about preferred beverages, dry patches, you're getting a much more accurate indication of median standard drinks that people are having each time, where people are just focusing on telling you their story as opposed to a number figure of standard drinks per a usual drinking occasion, which we don't ask. This is another paper that uses that same data set, and it's Tegan's PhD paper looking at how common is dependence in this urban and remote site, and what were some of the correlates of alcohol dependence that we've seen there. Because certainly as a Gamilaroi and A1 woman, Tegan would kind of say to me, you know, there's so much stigmatization around drinking. She was really keen to see, if you believed the media articles, you'd think that a lot of Aboriginal people were dependent as well, whereas she actually found it was only 2.2%. It was very similar to the Australian and the WHO reports on alcohol dependence. And she kind of talks about where to from here with that. And this is Tegan's next paper that's just out using the same sample, where she takes it to the next level. So the first paper told us about prevalence. This one is now telling us about what are the predictors of harms in people who are dependent, and what do we know about what help options people have? Because even though it was just the 2.2% of people that she found, we still want to know that those 2.2% and their families and loved ones, are they getting help? And what awareness do they have of local treatment options as well? Because that's kind of really practical information that local communities, elders, health services, etc., can use to tailor what they're doing on the ground. So where to from here? So the team was lucky enough to get an ideas grant that we just started this year. So we're extending the Grog app now to other drugs. So we're kind of making Scott's dream come true. He wanted to do A and the OD, as in alcohol and other drugs, but we were obviously advised just to downsize to alcohol and do that well. So we are extending it to tobacco, cannabis, or what we're calling yandi or ganja, ice or methamphetamines, heroin, strong painkillers, and benzos. The app will be flexible, so you could just choose to ask about alcohol, or you could ask about alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis, or you could ask about all drugs. And what we're doing with this new app that we'll call the Grog Survey App, as opposed to the Grog app, is that it will be platform agnostic. So we're using a progressive web app with our developers, because I was really keen. We've had a lot of inquiries from like people that do schools-based research, like with secondary students, and it would be great to be able to use it in a computer lab, for instance, and someone could just have headphones in so they could just listen to the questions. So, and also iPads are more expensive, and some of our partners have Android tablets as well. So that seemed like a good way for us to go. So just to summarize, this app is really a tool that communities as well as health services can use to help them monitor and reflect on drinking. And I think that's really important, particularly because it gives the power back to communities and health services to monitor how they're going with drinking, whether it's going up or whether it's stabilizing or whether people are drinking less, whatever the case may be. But most importantly, they can use the app to generate a report to feed that back to people who are decision makers, their local MPs, their or the state or Commonwealth governments, etc., to lobby for what they think is needed on the ground. And that's important because we're collecting data on any type of drinking, from no drinking right through to people who are dependent or hooked. But at this stage, it does need an iPad. However, the drug app that we're in the first year of development now will work with any tablet or a laptop. The Grog app's currently available, so it's just for free private download, which is it's just for private download from the Sydney Uni's App Store. The CIs the chief investigators on the Grog app had experiences before where apps had been developed for a non-profit purpose and had been kind of taken over and used by the alcohol industry. So they really wanted some way to kind of monitor who was using it, which is why most people just flick one member of our team for a link, and we've got a whole lot of links so we can kind of send it out to people. The app can be used as a health promotion tool, so where it doesn't collect data and you can just get someone to go through, it'll still calculate the standard drinks and still give you the tailored feedback, but it's not collecting any data. Or it can be used where you can have a survey lead or a CI set up a project, set up stratifications, say, I only want to collect data about young people 16 to 25, X number of men, X number of women, etc. And you can do the reports and download CSV sheets and the raw data and all of that kind of stuff. And it gets kind of, every time you sync, it kind of gets saved on a encrypted server with Sydney Uni. So definitely the benefit of being able to work offline is great in terms of the equity of the app, as well as just not having to go out with a dongle all the time. And it's already flexible and customizable, but we're trying to make it more flexible and more customizable. So things like those big pictures that you saw of the ladies drinking and the ladies coming into the drinking circle, they will, with the drug app, be replaced with, say, someone wants to do it for a general Australian population or for a Muslim majority population, which some of my colleagues are interested in doing. You could change the pictures as well as change the audio. We can already change the audio, it's just a bit clunky, but you'll be able to change those big banner pictures as well, so that whatever pictures people are seeing is going to meet the survey respondents that you're intending to deliver the app to. I think we really took a very ground up approach, so iterative, doing a whole lot of work reviewing the existing surveys, going back to people, user testing, etc., and checking all along the way, not only with our CI and AI team, but clinicians on the ground and health promotion workers on the ground, etc., just so that it can fit for the broadest target group. And at the moment, we're kind of trying to see what potential application it could have with other populations, other priority populations as well, such as culturally and other culturally and linguistically diverse groups, or even with pregnant women and their partners in antenatal care, and that kind of thing as well. Thank you for your time. I might stop sharing, and I'm very happy to take any questions as well.
Thank you so much, Kylie, for sharing your amazing work. Even though we can't see you all, if you can all give a huge virtual clap for Kylie for being here and sharing her work. And we have a few questions to ask you. There's a question related to the last comment you made about your future work. And it's by Adam. So if alcohol is a problem of equal size in Indigenous and other populations, is there still a need to prioritize drug and alcohol research effort on Indigenous people, or do we just need tailored surveys apps for every different population?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, Adam? I guess thank you for your question. My work has been primarily focused on the Aboriginal kind of area. And even in that area, we've had PhD students kind of look at the cultural utility of existing tools or adapting new tools. I think at the end of the day, it needs to be something that's going to suit the local context in which the survey is going to be delivered. But certainly some of my colleagues who are from Muslim majority population, they're really interested in looking at using this as well, in terms of how could we, it's very sensitive for different reasons to ask about drinking in their populations, and they're kind of looking at how to do it from there as well. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think it's a mixture of new tools and adapted tools. The tricky thing with new tools is that if everyone designs new tools, then how can we compare all of the results from the new tools, which is why we kind of retain some existing measures used to describe drinking as well. But happy to chat later if you need any more clarification, or if I made total no sense.
No, that made so much sense. Thanks, Kylie. And just our final question, and I'm super interested in this as well. It's related to the design incentives when you're providing the tailored feedback, and how to elicit accurate responses in surveys, apps, or diaries, and how to know if the incentives actually make a difference in terms of the accuracy of self-reporting.
Which incentives do you mean?
Design incentives like you incorporated within the app, I guess.
Oh, yeah. I think for us it was about listening to what it was a really uphill task, Adam. So we're talking about a population which is so stigmatized, and there's so much racism and that people experience every day. So but we had our Aboriginal CIs who really wanted to work out how to ask about drinking in a way that could make people feel comfortable. It's a really tricky one to answer. I think all I could say is that we, through our forums and through other means, you just really got to know. It's a little bit like your Jim Beam marketing to your audience. You really got to know who your audience is and how they think and what they're going to respond to. There was some, I don't know if this is of interest to you, but there was some functional devices like drop downs and other things that just never worked in our audience. So we always had to be quite explicit with what was on the screen. Even the carousels that you see there, they wobble and they shake, because I found that a lot of the more remote or the older people didn't realize that they could click the arrow across. So we're kind of, but ultimately it was all about creating a very safe place for us. We treaded the line between feeling like a game and not feeling like a game, because we wanted people to take it seriously, and we didn't want people to kind of zoom up the bottle and say, oh, I had 15 bottles of Jim Beam last night. So we kind of really it was a tall order to kind of create this space where people could not get heightened, not feel like it was a game, but where it's safe enough so that they can accurately report. I guess we were lucky as well, because it's about the setup with the RAs on the ground. So we had RAs on the ground who would tell them about it, tell them why we were doing it. So they were kind of primed. I was very lucky with our local Aboriginal RA team. They were primed, the respondent, before they came to me. And then I would just kind of have to set them up. I might stay with them for the first couple of screens where they're just doing how old they are and that kind of stuff, just to kind of show them the sliders and then get a sense. But most people in that validation study could just largely do it themselves, other than some Queensland older people that knew the RA really well and wanted to, they didn't want to use the headphones. They wanted everyone to be able to hear, because they were just in a one-on-one room. But I'd certainly, if you're developing other apps, one thing that I've had to constantly go back to app developers about, and I did that last night, was getting them to think around not just having literacy-based approaches and not just using the functionality or the navigation devices that my 5-year-old would be very comfortable with, because he's grown up using iPads, but it was the broadest brief possible. I still think you can come up with a visual, engaging tool that that is fit for our purpose, as opposed to fit for someone that is that's had a lot of exposure and privilege to using technology.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I definitely resonate with what Adam has said. Fantastic talk, lots of ideas on design I want to borrow. I feel exactly the same. And it was just so impressive to just see the app interface, also the illustration and consideration of understanding and providing examples within the actual survey question. I was so impressed.